Victor Sims, the Z historian. By 1980, only 16 years after independence, Zambia was no longer a country of simple certainties.
Copper wealth was declining, the country was a hardened one-party state, and in the silent conversations in Lusaka, men from the upper echelons of the republic were beginning to speak the language of treason. The plan was bold but dangerous. It is said to have been led by 6 very powerful men. First was Valentine Musakanya, a powerful Zambian civil servant, former secretary to the cabinet and head of the civil service. By 1980, Musakanya was one of the best-known political insiders ever linked to the plot. Second, Edward Shamwana, one of Zambia's most prominent lawyers, a sharp legal mind and major public figure. In the coup plot, he appears to have been the key civilian figure in the conspiracy network.
There's really no other way of changing the government except to remove him. And the removal in this case was a necessary coup d'etat.
And then there was Piers Anfield, a white Zambian lawyer with opposition connections, known for defending critics of the United National Independence Party, including Alice Lenshina and Simon Kapwepwe. Another lawyer was Mundia Sikatana, who later became a politician and diplomat, but during this period was part of the legal political circle tied to the coup. On the military side, Brigadier General Godfrey Mianda, a senior Zambia Army officer, and Major General Christopher Kabwe, the head of the Zambia Air Force at the time, are said to have been involved. Kabwe was particularly significant due to his control over air assets and close ties to the presidency. So seeing how most of the coup leaders were civilians, what exactly was the plan?
Sir, do you think this is a good idea?
The location is here. Chris, don't mess this up.
Step 1 would be to neutralize the president. General Kabwe, known to serve as Kaunda's presidential pilot, was tasked with diverting the presidential aircraft to a controlled location where Kaunda would be forced to announce his surrender. Next would come the political transition. Edward Shamwana or Valentine Musakanya were expected to front the interim government that would follow. It was daring. It was sophisticated, but it failed. But before we examine further why the coup plot failed and, of course, the consequences, we must ask how. How did President Kaunda, once hailed at independence as the custodian of Zambia's hopes, become, in the eyes of some of the country's elite, the very symbol of its decline? And why would some of the very people who had helped him build the republic want him gone? And here is where things get complicated. At independence, Zambia appeared prosperous. Copper revenues flowed generously. The government grew and education expanded. The country's progress seemed unstoppable. Furthermore, in newly independent Zambia, Kaunda was more than just a president. He was the moral symbol of the new African nation. To many Zambians, he did not merely govern the republic, he embodied its promise. He was the face of liberation, considered a God-given leader and the conscience of a country trying to define itself after colonial rule. In those early years, to believe in Kaunda was, in many ways, to believe in Zambia itself. However, at independence, Zambia is said to have been born on the horns of a paradox. On paper, this was one of Africa's great hopefuls, a peaceful transfer of power, enormous copper wealth, and a leader in Kenneth Kaunda who seemed determined to build a humane, united republic. But behind the optimism was a far messier inheritance. Politically, the new state was fragile from the very beginning. Britain had left Zambia with the first hybrid constitution, part Westminster, part Washington, a curious machine that concentrated a great deal of power in the presidency while still pretending to be liberal democratic. This gave Kaunda clear authority, especially over the armed forces, but it also meant the entire system revolved around one office, one man, one center of gravity. Socially, Zambia faced another problem that haunted many post-colonial states: How do you turn a colonial territory into a nation before ethnic, regional, and class divisions begin competing for the spoils of freedom? Moreover, independence did not magically erase provincial loyalties, old grievances, uneven development, or the reality that some groups had better access to power, education, and opportunity than others. In response, Kaunda tried to do something clever. He did not begin with a doctrine of class war or revolutionary purges. He began with a moral idea: one Zambia, one nation. It was simple, memorable, and politically useful. It told people, in effect, that whatever their language, province, or tribe, the republic would survive only if they learned to imagine themselves as Zambians first. It was less an ideology of conquest than a sermon against fragmentation. However, the One Zambia, One Nation sermon was competing with dwindling numbers. Zambia achieved independence with significant mineral resources, yet its economy rested on a fragile foundation. Copper fueled the new republic's growth, but also represented a peril, appearing to be a blessing while acting as a trap. As long as copper prices were high, the state could spend, expand, hire, build, and inspire confidence. Meanwhile, the country inherited underdevelopment, uneven infrastructure, and limited industrial diversification. So while independence delivered political sovereignty, it did not deliver economic immunity. The republic looked rich, but much of that wealth was structurally exposed. Militarily, the challenge was even more delicate. Zambia inherited not a revolutionary liberation army loyal to a nationalist movement, but a small, professional force molded by colonial doctrine. That may sound like an advantage, and in some ways it was, but it created a different kind of danger. The new state had to Africanize and expand the security forces without turning them into a political class with grievances, ambitions, and a taste for intervention. Across Africa, newly independent governments were discovering a brutal lesson. If you expanded an army too fast, promoted too recklessly, or politicized the officer corps too openly, the men with guns quickly developed opinions about civilian competence. And worse, they often developed plans. As such, Kaunda's strategy in the early years was cautious and remarkably disciplined. He did not smash the inherited military structure overnight in the name of nationalist theater. He sequenced reform. He retained experienced expatriate officers for continuity while gradually promoting Zambians into command. He strengthened civilian oversight through the presidency, the Ministry of Defense, and formal institutions of control. He broadened recruitment to avoid an army captured by one ethnic bloc or regional network. In other words, he tried to do what many post-colonial rulers failed to do: build a national military without turning it into either a colonial relic or a partisan militia.
All things considered, Kaunda's ideological restraint, inclusive political balancing, and careful institutional sequencing immediately after independence bought the country something very precious in those early years: stability.
But with the need to maintain stability at the time came centralization of power and the introduction of the one-party system. And with that introduction came chaos. While Kaunda's system was designed to maintain unity, it did not permanently resolve the contradictions inherent in the new republic. Worse still, Zambia's survival was tied not only to what happened within its borders, but to the fires burning beyond them. To be sure, Kaunda's principled support for the liberation struggles of Southern Africa gave Zambia immense moral stature, but it also made the country a frontline state in a very dangerous region. By sheltering and backing movements fighting white minority rule in Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, and Namibia, Zambia turned itself into a target. Its rail lines, roads, and strategic routes came under pressure. Its economy was strained by disrupted trade and security costs, and its territory became exposed to sabotage, infiltration, and retaliatory bombings.
We are attacking the terrorist base at Westlands Farm at this time. This attack is against Rhodesian dissidents and not against Zambia.
In moral terms, it seemed Kaunda stood on the right side of history. But a leader's performance is not measured by intentions alone. The same regional struggle that gave Kaunda moral authority abroad was slowly eroding confidence in his leadership at home. Worse still, to some, the declaration of the one-party state in 1972 and the growing centralization of power presented as necessary for unity, discipline, and national survival signaled something darker. That the republic was no longer liberal nor democratic. It was authoritarian. As the costs mounted, as shortages deepened, and as the state demanded more sacrifice from a weary nation, some within Zambia's own elite began to ask a dangerous question. Was Kaunda still protecting the republic or exhausting it? It was in that widening gap between liberation idealism and national frustration that disillusionment took root. And in that soil, men like Valentine Musakanya would begin to imagine the unthinkable. Valentine Musakanya was not just another disgruntled insider. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the post-independence Zambian elite at its most brilliant, most ambitious, and ultimately most disillusioned. Musakanya rose from unlikely beginnings to become one of the sharpest minds of his generation. Secretary to the cabinet, head of the civil service, minister of state, governor of the Bank of Zambia, and a man widely regarded as intellectually formidable, cosmopolitan, and even presidential in stature. He is described by some commentators as one of the leading Zambian political and intellectual figures and deeply committed to democratic governance, modern political practice, and the rule of law. He pushed science and technology, helped establish the Zambia Air Services Training Institute to train Zambian pilots, and thought ahead of his time about urban development, warning early about informal settlements and arguing that government should service them before they became permanent slums. A few years after independence, Musakanya was disturbed by UNIP's Youth Brigade campaign against women wearing miniskirts. The party justified it as a defense of traditional Zambian culture, but Musakanya saw it differently. While he was not necessarily in favor of miniskirts, his objections centered on the government's distortion of history and culture to justify party policies, while distracting itself with private moral policing instead of tackling the real challenges of nation building. To him, this romanticizing of culture and interference in personal choices exposed an early and dangerous pattern. A government beginning to forsake serious responsibilities of the state in favor of symbolism, control, and convenient myths. And that, perhaps, is where the fracture began. The divide was clear. On one side stood those considered westernized, technocratic elite who believed in a neutral, competent state, and on the other stood politicians who believed that legitimacy flowed not only from elections, but also from liberation credentials and party supremacy. Men like Musakanya and his circle saw themselves as guardians of standards, efficiency, legality, and modern governance. UNIP increasingly saw them as aloof, obstructive, elitist, and even unpatriotic dissidents. Yet for all his apparent intellect and moral seriousness, Musakanya struggled to turn critique into a viable political challenge. He could diagnose what he considered UNIP's weakness with precision, but he could not easily navigate the compromises and calculations through which power was actually contested. And so, caught between principle and impatience, he became drawn into something far more dangerous than dissent, a bold effort to remove Kaunda and UNIP from power by force.
Now what's interesting is that initially the 1980 coup plot did not seem like a coup or a plot. To conspirators, it seemed more like the usual conversation.
Like many dangerous things in politics, it began not with gunfire, but with men talking in respectable places. At the Lusaka Flying Club, in the orbit of the Wednesday Club, and later in more private settings such as Edward Shamwana's house, a circle of educated, well-connected men began to do what educated, well-connected men often do first: diagnose the sickness of the state. They spoke of Kaunda, of UNIP, of the one-party order, of a country they believed was drifting towards stagnation, fear, and closure. And somewhere in those conversations, criticism began to harden into design.
No choice but to reconsider our position entirely.
According to Musakanya's account, he had indirectly introduced Deogratias Simba, his old Katangeze contact, to some of the plotters. From there, the conspiracy took on a harder, more dangerous shape. The idea emerged of using Katangeze gendarmes as the main armed force behind the operation. After the defeat of the Shaba invasions in Zaire, Simba, now acting as the political leader of those fighters, allegedly agreed to mobilize them for the coup. In return, a new Zambian government would provide a rear base for renewed action against Mobutu's Zaire. Simba then worked with Anfield and Sikatana to mobilize about 60 men to a farm south of Lusaka recently purchased by Anfield. Another 140 Katangese were reportedly held in reserve. At that point, the plot ceased to be merely elite discontent. It became an operational conspiracy, and there was no turning back. Step by step then, the architecture becomes clearer. First, remove the president by controlling his movement. Second, force a public stepping down. Third, rely on a mixed armed force of internal military actors and neighboring gendarmes. Fourth, secure weapons and staging grounds. And finally, announce an interim order before the state could recover. Simple, right? Wrong.
All teams confirm readiness for immediate deployment.
We have confirmation on the target location.
To be sure, the conspirators were planning against a one-party regime that had narrowed political space precisely because it feared subversion. In such an environment, every meeting risked surveillance, every new recruit increased exposure, and every delay invited betrayal. Even more striking, after Zimbabwe's independence in April 1980, Kaunda publicly accused Elias Chipimo, Musakanya, and other Wednesday Club figures of meeting at the Flying Club to remove him from power. Musakanya denied involvement in the Times of Zambia, and yet, astonishingly, despite that public warning, the plot appears to have continued. And that may have been the moment the conspiracy fatally weakened. And soon, there came a silent realization that what looked bold in theory may prove suicidal in practice. But by then, the die had already been cast, and swiftly the state moved in. So the 1980 coup attempt failed. Government forces launched a dawn raid on the farm in Chilanga, killing 1 man and wounding 4 others. There were arrests, interrogations, and several conspirators, including Musakanya, were sentenced to death. But even after the trials, the question that remained was, who wanted Kaunda gone? So let's review what we know from available evidence. We know who the main domestic and external conspirators were, and the fact that the plot had an actual operational design involving both civilian and military elements to make the seizure of power look nationally credible. The political elements behind the coup are equally revealing. The deeper cause of the conspiracy, however, seems to lie in the failure of legal opposition. Nearly all credible sources repeatedly link the coup's origins to the defeated UPP and to Simon Kapwepwe's frustrated effort to challenge Kaunda through constitutional means. But writers are careful here. Most say Kapwepwe's role in initiating the coup must be treated cautiously. Indeed, much of the evidence linking him to the coup comes from plotters themselves, and by the time the plot was exposed, he had already died. But the evidence still suggests that, after his Supreme Court defeat in 1979, many around him came to believe that more direct means were necessary. Kapwepwe is therefore central, but in a paradoxical way. Historians suggest he may have known about elements of the plan, yet many former UPP supporters insisted he opposed violence and preferred industrial pressure to an outright seizure of power. Plans were reportedly made to keep him out of direct involvement and even move him to France before the action. Then, he died in January 1980 and everything changed. His death radicalized the atmosphere, deepened suspicion of the state, removed a restraining figure, and accelerated the determination of his lieutenants to act. And this is where Musakanya becomes the most complex figure in the entire story. He appears as businessman, insider, dissident, financier, and possible strategist. The record supports a significant role for him, including post-funeral travel with Goodwin Mumba to Paris to collect $2 million allegedly raised through Anfield's French connections. Yet the evidence also suggests a wobbling center. After Kaunda publicly named some conspirators and their meeting place in April 1980, the plot still went ahead. This suggests either recklessness, internal fragmentation, or a belief that backing from military and external networks could still rescue the operation. Another major layer is labor politics. Several sources record meetings between plotters and ZCTU leaders, including Frederick Chiluba and Chitalu Sampa, in which a general strike was discussed as the first lever to topple Kaunda, with military takeover as a second step if Kaunda did not yield. This makes the 1980 plot look less like a pure barracks coup and more like an attempted convergence of elite opposition, labor unrest, and selected security actors. Yet the union leadership later retreated from direct involvement. Their reasons remain unclear. But the retreat may have fatally weakened the conspiracy by stripping it of the mass political cover it needed. The external dimension is also critical, but here again we must be wary of simplistic conclusions. There is strong evidence of Katangi's FLNC participation in the operational side. There is also evidence that Anfield fled and later initiated contact with South African intelligence during the 1981 rescue attempt. But most writers are cautious about South Africa's role in the original 1980 coup itself. Otherwise, it remains unclear whether there was indeed some initial funding coming from South Africa. And if Kaunda had possessed definitive proof, it almost certainly would have been used at trial. Finally, the actual collapse of the plot also reveals a lot. It is claimed the seizure of power was planned for October 17, 1980, but the day before, government forces raided the Chilanga farm, killing 1 man and wounding 4. Later, 13 people, including 4 Zairians, were charged.
There was a gang here of foreigners that was preparing to topple this government, and that this gang was hired by certain Zambian elements. Thanks to the really extremely effective and good work of our defense and security forces, thanks to the cooperation of the people, of our people, especially those in the Shibuyunji area, party militants and ordinary people there, and the whole Mumba area, we have now captured more than 40 of these people. We have since arrested some Zambians through the information that we got. And as I say, I think the state is very happy to prosecute both these Zambian elements as well as the foreign elements they were going to use to overthrow our government.
This means the state defeated the plot twice. First physically at Chilanga, then legally through a trial process that was itself tainted by torture. That contradiction is at the heart of the story. The state defended itself, but it also damaged its own legitimacy in the process. That torture question is not incidental, as it complicates every confident claim about the exact hierarchy inside the conspiracy.
So the challenge over the years has not been to deny the coup attempt, but rather to separate the undeniable core from the possibly exaggerated periphery.
The most defensible conclusion is that the state did not invent the conspiracy, but it likely enlarged its moral and political usefulness once it had been uncovered. Ultimately, from available facts and evidence, it can be concluded that the 1980 coup attempt happened because Zambia's one-party state had narrowed legitimate routes for elite descent, because post-UPP networks remained alive underground, because Kapwepwe's constitutional defeat and death convinced some actors that time had run out, and because a coalition of lawyers, businessmen, military officers, labor contacts, and Katangizi fighters believed they could manufacture both force and legitimacy at once. But the same complexity that made the plot ambitious also made it unstable. It depended on too many moving parts: secrecy, money, labor unrest, army cooperation, Air Force leverage, foreign fighters, and a credible interim civilian face. So the real question is not who wanted Kaunda dead, but how did a liberation-era system reach a point where insiders, not outsiders, concluded that the Republic could no longer be changed from within. And once the Republic reached that point, coup or not, the old political order had already begun dying. And even after the dust of the 1980 coup had apparently settled, everyone watched to see who would deliver the final blow.
Some of you, or many of you, have visited other countries away from here. Maybe in Europe, perhaps in America, in Asia, or even in Africa. And you have seen those countries being or looking better than our own. Let me tell you the secret. Let me tell you the secret. The beauty and the success, the honey and the milk you saw wherever you went, never dropped in heaven. The people created the world themselves. That is the secret. The secret lies in your hands and mine. To change our work ethic, to consider everything we do as being important, so important that if we abandon it, nobody else will do it for us, and there will be nothing but damage, nothing but destruction, nothing but retrogression and regression, retardation of development.